the premise of today's talk. So human sociality is all about flexibility. And this includes everything from parochial altruism to climate change adaptation. And yes, we really will cover all those bases today. So the things that I want you to get from this talk, 3 main points. First thing, so humans vary in how we manage risk, and parochial altruism varies accordingly. I think these two things are related. When risk management involves relationships spanning distance, this changes social network structure, and this has implications in turn for climate change adaptation. So studying which adaptations emerge on these networks in response to which features of climate can help us support climate change adaptation going forward. So humans are masters of variability, as many of you know. So this is true whether we look at human ancestors, for example. If we look at the course of human evolution over the last 6 to 7 million years, as you can see here, there's been big changes in oxygen in the atmosphere, which has meant big changes over millennia in terms of how hot, how cold it is, precipitation along with that. And this is also true in present and past subsistence societies. So what we're looking at here are data from Kim Hill, for example, and we see hunting data on how much meat people get per day. Now, the more days you sample, you can see as you move across this log scale on the x-axis, the less and less variability, right, in who is a good hunter and who is bad. Good is on top. But even for good hunters, if you're looking over a 10-day sampling period over there on the left, you can see there's this huge amount of variability. Those are only the bottom part of this range of distribution, those lines. So lots of variability, even in how much food you bring home day to day. And humans are masters of variability, hopefully, even now in the face of climate change. So climate change not only changes, for example, mean temperatures, mean precipitation, but also variability in that. This is a figure from a paper I have under review, and later in the talk, I'll actually be talking about features like autocorrelation and duration of events that actually impact, I think, what we're likely to see in terms of human adaptation. So because we're masters of variability, our mastery of variability makes us variable. So if we think about adaptation here, as I'll talk a bit about later, in terms of cultural adaptation, these are 6 categories that have been recognized since the 1980s by archaeologists in terms of how folks respond to variability in climate, especially risk management, given that variability. And it includes some, as you can see, some pretty broad categories. But our use as individuals and as societies of these categories in different ways also makes us variable. Not everyone is using mobility or crop diversification to the same degree. So what I think sometimes is underappreciated, probably not by this group, but by many people in the evolutionary social sciences, for example, in social psychology, in anthropology, and beyond, is that variability in our strategies for managing risk often produces variability in intergroup relationships, more so than I think we often characterize to the public. And so this is something I'll be returning to throughout the talk. So to begin, again, for many in this group, you don't need this definition, but parochial altruism, right, is part of these intergroup relationships. And parochial altruism specifically refers to a hypothesis that links in-group favoritism with out-group hostility. So that is, we're actually looking at in-group favoritism causing out-group hostility, or the two paired together in one way or another. That is actually the hypothesis, right, about parochial altruism, is that they're linked. So parochial altruism is related to things like xenophobia, tribalism, and parochialism, so just that out-group hostility without the in-group favoritism. And these are all topics that capture both public and academic imaginations. There's been many books written about this. When we think about a lot of ethnographic data from humans or think about primatological data, we, again, are often thinking about parochial altruism, xenophobia, or tribalism, for example. But the thing, of course, as you know, is that unsurprisingly, parochial altruism varies quite a bit. So here I'm looking at Angelo Romano's data et al., of course, but there's many other examples I could use. So again, here, many of you know this paper, but for those of you who don't, We're looking at in-group favoritism, which is just half of parochial altruism across countries. And as you can see, we can look here at the mean giving, we can look at the variance, but there's quite a lot of variability. First of all, across countries, you see a lot more in Germany, for example, than you do in Argentina. But then additionally, even within countries, you have that variance, right? So people are not all behaving the same way. So the question then becomes, why does parochial altruism vary so much? So here's a disclaimer. So this preprint here, there's a QR code for it, is under revision. And actually, we plan to be resubmitting it in the next week or so. So if you look at it today, it'll look one way. If you look at it in 7 days, it will look different. I'm hoping that you see more of the different than the today version, but there's the link just the same. So why does parochial altruism vary so much? To give you a little idea of why that could be, I want to talk to you a bit about my work in Bolivia, exploring parochial altruism in that context. So Bolivia is in the middle of South America. And in Bolivia, since 2010, 2012, I've been working with 3 different ethnic groups. So they're actually pueblos indígenas, so different indigenous populations in Bolivia. There's 4 communities in total here whose data I'll be talking about, and they're from these 3 different pueblos indígenas, from a pueblo indígena called the Interculturales. So they are mostly of descent from the Andes. I'm here in the lowlands, I'm working in the Amazon, and so Interculturales, for the most part, their families moved from the Andes to the lowlands and brought some cultural institutions with them, which is pretty cool. The Mosatén have been living in the area for as long as we have record, and genetic data supports that. Shamane as well have been there for a very long time, and they're relatively well known. You may have encountered their work about them in the literature before. So Interculturales, Mosetenes, and Chimanes all practice one mode of production. So they're all what are sometimes called horticulturalists, or doing shifting agriculture. That means that they slash and burn and then grow in the plot that they have just prepared and then move after a 3-year period or so to a new plot. So let me tell you one more thing before I go to this next part. In Bolivia, in the last 2 decades or so, there's been increasing emphasis on pueblos indígenas, on these different indigenous groups. And because of that, the government now actually recognizes these groups, gives them rights, gives them resources. And this has changed the dynamic politically in terms of how much different pueblos indígenas are competing with each other for recognition and for resources. This is very much part of the discourse there. Additionally, me, coming from the literature where we often emphasize intergroup conflict and emphasize parochial altruism in the evolutionary social science literature, was expecting to find parochial altruism on the ground. So, not knowing about the IPD-MD at the time, I designed a game that I was hoping would capture this trade-off between in-group favoritism and out-group favoritism, a zero-sum game. So this is a game I sometimes call the non-anonymous giving game, or the NAG, and I'll explain why it's called that in just a minute. But this is a multi-recipient game. So here on the left, we have the setup. Basically, what I do is I show participants 6 different photos of real people, and 3 photos on the left belong to one group the participant either does or doesn't belong to, so a different ethnic group or a different religious group. And then the ones on the right belong to, say, their in-group, and I varied which side the in-group and out-group were on. I make sure that they're all strangers, so the participant doesn't know any of them. And then I array 3 coins on every one of the 6 photos and 3 coins for the participant themselves. So starting with a fair distribution. And I say, you can move all the coins you want. You can move them between photos. You can take coins for yourself, or you can give coins from your pile to individuals on the photos. I walk away, and then I say, when you're ready, tell me, I'll come back. I come back and I count the coins. The participant also knows that at the end of the field season, I will give all the coins to that person in the participant's name. They'll know that person's name and their group membership. So here what we're getting first is that the recipients are not anonymous, nor are the deciders. Recipients are not known to the decider, and the decider is not anonymous. And so what that does is it actually the idea was, right, created an opportunity to be generous and get credit for it with both in-group and out-group members that you've never encountered before. Key here also is that the game is zero sum. So if I take coins from one photo, it goes to another. So if I want to favor in-group members, that means I have to take money away from a fair distribution from out-group members. So what you can see here is there's elements of a lot of different popular economic games here. You can see a little bit of this random allocation game popping up in terms of fairness and deviations from that. And you can see clear relationships to in-group favoritism as measured in a variety of different games. So what I found is in-group favoritism varies across these three populations. So here you can see the scatter of how many bolivianos, that's the local currency, those coins, are being given to out-group recipients by the folks who are playing these games. So the first thing to notice is that 82% gave something to out-group recipients. Now, I did start with a fair distribution of coins, so that likely primed people to give something. And you can see here for the interculturales and mosetenes, there is a cluster around 3, that fair distribution of people who stayed with that, who didn't want to change things. But what you can also see is that some folks did move coins. And that was especially true for Tsimane. So Tsimane had the highest in-group favoritism. This was true whether I was using group membership as pueblos indígenas, as ethnic groups, or as religious groups. Tsimane mostly identify as evangelical Christian, and so they were often giving more coins to evangelical Christians than to Catholics, the other major group. So Tsimane had higher levels of in-group favoritism. Now, the time now, of course, is to step back and ask what economic experiments like this one tell us. And it ends up, if you look at the literature in this preprint that I mentioned with Cody Ross, you see that people have different interpretations about what economic experiments mean. And oftentimes you'll see economists come back and say, hey, wait a second, we need to actually pay attention to exactly what these things measure. So when people talk about parochial altruism, they may be talking about one of these many different phenomena. And this is where I credit Simon for actually helping me think through this a little bit more through comments he gave us on the paper. So what we can do is we can think about things like context. So what is the distribution of resources? What are these incentives to compete over those resources? What are group norms and group institutions? We can think about individual characteristics, both what Karsten de Droog refers to as these kinds of chronic long-term conditions that individuals have in terms of their personality or their social value orientation, but also things like past experiences. These things can affect individuals' internal states, which can then, of course, affect their behavior. And internal states here can refer to preferences, motivations, all those things that actually perceive behavior. Additionally, context, knowing which rules you're playing by, may actually lead to behavior in a way that overrides your preferences, overrides those internal states. And so we can think about different components of this larger puzzle for how we get parochial altruism, and also as researchers, which part of this whole system we're actually measuring. So most people who are using economic games, like the one I mentioned, are actually attempting to measure internal states. So attempting to measure something like social value orientation or our preferences, something that is kind of this long-term thing that is potentiating, some folks would argue, but not everybody, is potentiating behavior. Now, something else that matters, of course, in this system is thinking about context. And that's going to be really important now to our interpretation of the results from the Tsimane, mosetenes, and interculturales. So context is key. So the reason for this, especially for the Tsimane, is that discrimination and inequality that they've experienced really make group membership salient, especially being a member of the Pueblo Indígena Tsimane. So starting here on the left, what we're looking at is market items owned across different households. What I did is I asked all households about various market items that they could have in the household. The Tsimane distribution is truncated because they have a lot less than the other two populations. So that's why you'll see here that all of the distribution here, this normalized distribution, is all negative. There's a positive side, but the Tsimane drop off. And what we're seeing here in terms of the model is the predicted amount of Bolivianos given to an outgroup recipient based on population. So what you can see is that as Tsimane households own more market goods, they're actually giving less, right, with some range of uncertainty here, to outgroup recipients. And what I think is actually going on with that, when you look at the ethnographic data, is that Tsimane report having very unpleasant interactions with outgroup members. When they go to town, they often experience discrimination. People often refer to Tsimane as backwards, for example, or as not knowing how to do things in town. They look differently at them than they do at other people. I've seen it happen in the Tsimane report that as well. They experience that. And so that experience of group status, of being lower on this hierarchy than other groups, in some ways has led Tsimane to, first of all, kind of move off away from other groups. So historically, Tsimane have moved further and further away, for example, from contact with white colonizers in Bolivia. And then additionally, has led Tsimane to primarily just interact with other Tsimane. And so what we see here is in-group favoritism that reflects reality, experiences with other groups in the past. So again, that kind of updates that context in this larger system of parochial altruism. These past experiences are important in terms of individual differences, and further context in terms of opportunities for outgroup cooperation and whether it's even worth it. So why does parochial altruism vary so much? For a lot of reasons. First of all, thinking about the system that may actually output parochial behavior, parochial altruistic behavior. We can think about differences in the net benefits, that is the benefits versus costs of parochial altruism. They can track things like individual personality. So some individuals may see more benefits to that than others, for example, based on their openness to experience. Additionally, context matters, as we just established. But further, and this is something Cody and I caution everyone in this paper, researcher expectations matter with respect to whether or not we think we'll find parochial altruism. Again, I thought I would find it in Bolivia, so I went looking for it. And also the methods we use. So the very game I had there in terms of the distribution of coins, the fact that I was showing photos as opposed to talking about someone anonymous, the fact that individuals had a pile of coins in front of them as well as in front of all these different individuals, that changes, of course, the findings that I have. So you may recall, looking at that scatter plot, that for the Mossetenes and Interculturales, you have a lot of scatter with respect to how much is being given to outgroup members. And most people are giving more than zero to members of other different pueblos indígenas and other different religious groups. And what this is really picking up on is something that I can't get from a game, but that I get from spending a lot of time with these communities. I'm, of course, an anthropologist, right? So that's often what I'm doing. And what I find is that ethnic boundaries are not very salient for these groups. So for starters, Mossetenes and Interculturales are very intermarried. So 50% of all households in these communities have a couple in them from two different ethnic groups. So the kids speak Spanish because their parents speak different native languages. And the households may have one Mosseten parent, might have one intercultural parent. They marry and they have a household together. So you have these intergroup relationships in the same household. Additionally, and this will become important in a second, I asked people about where their friends live who live far away. And when I did that, originally I was asking what this friend's identity was, what their ethnic identity was. And I actually had to stop asking the question during the field season because it just made participants completely, we would say in English, flummoxed, or just completely stopped. They just couldn't answer the question. They had no idea. And they would often guess. So I would say, for example, where does your friend live at a distance, who helps you? And they'll say they live in La Paz, the capital city. And then I say, so what is their pueblo indígena? And people would guess. They say, well, they live in La Paz, so they must be Coya or Camba. And these aren't even pueblos indígenas. These are these kinds of larger names they use in Bolivia for people from the Andes, Coya or Camba from the lowlands. And so people just guessed at the group identities of their friends, right? So they don't actually know. So despite me thinking that group membership, pueblos indígenas especially, were going to be so salient and important in Bolivia because of all the politics there, because of what I'd been reading in the literature, that wasn't the case. Instead, what I found is that when it comes to social relationships, distance matters a lot. This is my segue away from parochial altruism, just so everyone knows. This is where we're going to start talking about long distance relationships. So distance matters a lot for relationships in Bolivia and in other parts of the world. So in Bolivia, distance matters a lot for access to things, first of all, that you can only get in the city. I mentioned La Paz. La Paz is a 6-hour drive away from the Mocetades and Interculturales. It takes all day. Also takes several days' salary to go and come back, so it's expensive. So what people do first is you can send boxes of stuff from the city to the country and from the country to the city. So the things moving from city to country include things like specialty foods like dried llama meat, which is interesting. You should try it if you ever get a chance. Also, things like cheap technology, cell phones. It's much cheaper to get a smartphone in the capital city than in the country. And so these things will move by bus from the city to the country. You also see lots of access to wage labor. A lot of people have friends in Argentina or Chile who can tell them about jobs in agriculture or in factories that are available, and then they can go get those jobs. And in the capital city of La Paz, you can actually have a place to stay if you have a friend there. It saves you money when it's already so expensive to make that trip. Additionally, as I mentioned, jobs that pay well are very difficult to find locally if you want, especially if you want something like wage labor, right? That's often easier to get at a distance. So when I ask people who can help you find a good job that pays well, as you can see, a lot of folks are naming people who live over 100 kilometers away. And they're calling those folks for jobs when they actually want some money. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing something that I call long distance relationships. And long distance relationships are not always intergroup relationships. So for example, if you're intercultural living in the lowlands, if your parents or grandparents are Aymara or Quechua, two ethnic groups from the highlands, then if you have a connection in La Paz, who's also Aymara or Quechua, you're not really crossing any ethnic group boundaries. That said, you're really crossing distance. And I think sometimes we lose the message here in terms of managing risk and accessing resources in terms of whether we're seeing intergroup relationships or long distance relationships, because long distance relationships have been really key to managing risk for humans. So intergroup ties have been very influential in how we think about human sociality. There's also something else for those of you who know from the social network literature called long ties. So when you have multiple nodes of different connections and you have two people who are connected across multiple different kind of intermediary relationships. There might be 3 or 4 degrees of separation between us, but then we forge a relationship. Those are called long ties. All those things, intergroup ties, long ties, are different from long distance ties. So long distance ties can span group boundaries, but they don't have to. And they can be long ties, have a bunch of connections between them, and then you make that connection with that person who's 4 or 5 degrees of separation away, but that doesn't have to cross distance either. So all 3 of these are different distinct things that can affect human sociality and affect the way that we think about social relationships. So long distance ties, importantly, just so you know, vary quite a bit. So how and when they're formed and maintained, you can have a marriage form a long distance tie. It can be a friendship. It can be, in Bolivia, a godparent relationship. That's an important way to do it. How they're maintained matters. You might do it on social media. You might do it in person. And additionally, what moves through them, resources, support, can vary. And how far away they are can vary very much, let me say that differently, can vary quite a bit in response to socioecology. So for example, in Bolivia, having a connection that's 6 hours away can be really key. Here in the Western US, we may be experiencing risk very similarly across the 6-hour radius. I may need a connection further away to help me if we experience a drought. So long distance ties are often involved in things I mentioned before, like risk pooling, right? So if I experience a drought here in the Western US, it may help me to have a connection somewhere else in the world. Also things like exchange and mobility. So when people, for example, move to the US from Central America now, facing climate change and facing political oppression, they will often come to someone they know in the US. So those long distance ties can be key to mobility. In this section, I'm actually talking about work, just so you know, from Jamie Jones, Matt Turner, and Elspeth Reddy primarily. I collaborate with them on some of these papers, but this is their work that really informs how I think. So I wanted to share this with you. So long distance relationships change social networks. And what they do is they create networks that have peripheries. So what do I mean by peripheries? Let's look at this social network over here on the left. We can go ahead and think about this network as having a core and a periphery. So a core in the network context refers to kind of a densely interconnected group of different nodes, in this case, people, and they share a lot of ties with each other and not so much to people outside that core. The periphery, on the other hand, may be a little dense group of ties, but there's not that many nodes in it, and it has just a few connections to the core that is, in this case, as you can see, nearby. Another way to visualize this is to think actually about K-cores. So the people who are the most connected, if we reorganize the visualization this way, are here in the center in yellow. So cores and peripheries, what do they do in terms of, say, moving resources around? In peripheries, what happens is that you often get things like resource diversification. So you have individuals who, for example, have access to very different kinds of things. They can access a little bit from one ecology, a little bit from another. And the modularity of a periphery, the fact that there's only a few nodes in it and it's kind of by itself in the social network, means that it's good for managing correlated shocks. So what that means is that if there's a big shock, like a drought that strikes the Western US, and I'm in a core, all of us in the core are going to get hit by that drought. But people in the periphery of my social network may not be, right? And so that can be really good for me as an individual in the core to manage shocks through connections with the periphery. Now, the core itself has a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of redundant ties, and that's really good for managing idiosyncratic risk, like the hunting risk I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. If I come home one day empty-handed from hunting, very likely my neighbor will actually have some meat that day and can share with me. So these idiosyncratic risks where households differ in their experiences day to day, those can be managed very well in cores. So humans, again, are masters of variability, and that's what we're seeing here in terms of social network structures. In fact, the relationships that we form and maintain actually structure the social networks that researchers then measure as social scientists, and are often capturing humans' strategies in terms of risk management as we're looking at who's connected to whom. Now, what else moves through this network? Not just resources, but maybe some other resources that are actually informational. So in the periphery, for example, what Turner et al. Find, and this isn't a preprint that you can find in SocArchive, what they find is that there's actually more innovation in terms of cultural information. So individuals in peripheries often come up with new ideas, and those new ideas can persist because they're not being swamped, they're not being kind of moved away by all the ideas coming from this really interconnected core. And so that innovation can be really key to the whole system in terms of generating new ideas. In the core, instead, what you find is that if innovation makes it there from the periphery, it can be stored because it's moving from person to person. Turner et al. Actually talk about it as a battery, right? It stores that energy, it stores that innovation. The problem, of course, though, as I mentioned, is that there's a risk of swamping peripheral innovation with innovation from the core. So if individuals in the core have all adopted a certain way of dealing with drought, their way of dealing with drought sometimes is brought to those peripheral communities by nonprofits or aid organizations, and it then swamps all of the variability in those peripheral communities. So long-distance relationships create these ties between cores and peripheries that can both move resources and move information. And this informational movement is really key when we're thinking about climate change adaptation. So another segue here, talking about another part of my work. So the information stored in these networks can be really key to responding to some of the things we're experiencing here. These are all examples from the Northwest of the United States. Things like sea level rise, drought and wildfire. We experience a lot of wildfire smoke, and even things like landslides. The person in the car was okay. I know it looks very concerning, but they were okay. And what Antonio Gutierrez says is that we need progress in adaptation in order to reinforce our resilience to climate change, right? This is something that's very much a focus, including of COP27 in the fall of last year. So to actually understand what the UN Secretary General is trying to encourage us to do here, progress in adaptation, we first need to understand what adaptation means. And it usually means something very different to evolutionary social scientists than it does to folks at the UN. So if we look at the various definitions people have of adaptation, whether it's in biology, evolutionary social science, or even in the development sector, the common denominator is that adaptations manage risks posed by the environment. That's it. And the thing that's important for our purposes is they can be both biological and cultural. Now, what do I mean here by cultural adaptations? Let me give you an example. So this paper, this is Brangford et al., 2021, basically reviews data from across the world in terms of adaptation to climate change. And they break it down into 4 different categories. They talk about infrastructural adaptations, they talk about institutional adaptations, behavioral or cultural, and nature-based. So they're breaking this down in all different categories and looking at how many, say, adaptations in Africa are cultural versus nature-based. And as you can see, the red line's a little higher on that side, meaning that there's more cultural ones. Now, here's the thing. So if you ask someone from our line of work what a cultural adaptation is, it's actually all 4 of these categories. So the kinds of infrastructure we built that's a product of culture. If you're in the Netherlands and you're thinking about water management, that's a cultural thing in the Netherlands, right? It's been passed down for a long period of time. If you look at institutional solutions, so how government is organized, for example, that's cultural too. And nature-based solutions here, they're referring to things like how you plow your fields or what kinds of fertilizer you use, which is also cultural. So if you take this all together, I would say that adaptation is cultural. It evolves culturally, and it involves all of these features of evolution that we see in biological adaptation too. Innovation, modification, selective retention of what works, and transmission of what works to other people. So whether we're thinking about communities, for example, individuals in peripheral communities, in rural communities, in those networks we talked about, or even organizations, what groups like the UN decide to focus on, climate change adaptation culturally evolves. These ideas are transmitted from one person to another. There's different innovations that then spread and affect the way we do things. It's all culture. Now at COP27, the Adaptation Fund, which is this long-lasting thing that's existed but hasn't been funded very regularly, received $230 million. It's not a lot of money, but it's something. And this is meant to support the most climate vulnerable in terms of their adaptation, right? In terms of them actually responding to the risk of climate change. Yet, the Brangford paper that I mentioned on the last page mentions that there's stark inadequacy of current methods and evidence available to assess the effectiveness of responses in terms of risk reduction. And I clarify here, available to development scholars. That's my little addition there, because they're just reviewing the development literature. So oftentimes they don't know what we know. So what is needed? Brangford et al. Say data on the durability of documented adaptation responses, how long it takes for benefits to accrue, and to whom they accrue. So how do we actually answer this call? How do we provide data on the durability of documented adaptation responses, how long it takes before benefits accrue, and who gets the benefits of them? Where should we begin? So I have 3 ideas about where we should begin, and this is a large part of what my research program is focusing on these days, is focusing on climate change adaptation. So the first thing that I overview in a paper from last year in Nature Climate Change, if you want to see more, is that we need to share what we already know about grassroots climate change adaptation. Grassroots here meaning, for example, ideas that emerge in communities, in those peripheries, away from the cores that are, say, urban centers. And here, what we know is that, the data that do exist actually suggests that local innovations can be pretty adaptive for the people who have them, right? So they can be good at managing risk, and they persist for that reason, right? They're selectively retained and they're transmitted. So if you look at the graphic over here on the left, you'll see that actually having innovation shared between communities is pretty key. We think that's something that should be supported. But additionally, development actors, groups like the UN, should be careful not to swamp those peripheries with their ideas. So as you can see here, these little arrows going from innovation to the two communities from the flag right there at the bottom, the development actors, that's a really narrow arrow. So they shouldn't be transmitting too much cultural information to those communities, but instead learning from them, which is why the arrow's thicker on the other side, learning from what communities know. This is something we've been working on in a couple of special issues. So the first is from the American Journal of Human Biology. This is from 2021, work between a bunch of different individuals organized by J.B. Jones and myself, focused on what anthropologists know already about grassroots adaptation and what communities are doing. And then a new special issue that's coming out this year in Phil-Trans B is also focused on what we know and how we can actually collect those data. And one of those papers, mine, is actually already out that overviews that idea. So if you're interested, you can check the QR code there. If you miss it this time, I'll show it at the end of the talk again. And that talks a bit about what we actually know, what adaptation is, and how we think we should study it. Another thing we can do is actually study the relationship between climate and grassroots climate change adaptation. And what I mean here is that we've talked in this talk about climate variability and how that creates risk and how people manage that risk. But the thing is, not all variability is the same, right? It looks different. It's experienced differently by the people who are on the ground. So for example, here we're looking at data from Burkina Faso from 1991 to 2010. And we're looking at precipitation data. So we're looking at rainfall. And what you can see is that rainfall can be really high or really low across different seasons. So here, for example, you can see that there was a drought of 2 months there in 1992. That's there on the left-hand side. You can see that popped up. And the D there means a 2-month duration, which is key. When drought lasts longer, it's harder for people to respond to it. When things are highly autocorrelated here, you'll see on the left, right, they're very clustered. So if you experience one thing, you're likely to experience another thing very soon. And you can also see that the frequency of experiences of high or low precipitation varies across time. So there's lots of different facets of variability that are happening here that can affect people in different ways. So for example, if we want to think about risk pooling, long distance relationships can help with risk management, right? With pooling risk across distances. And what we're exploring now in a follow-up paper, this is a paper here I'm talking about that's under review, right? In a new paper following up on that, is that we expect things like high severity, so long duration of events that are particularly intense or are particularly high in magnitude, for example, floodwaters that get to a really high level, that when things are high severity, when things are very frequent, when one follows another back to back, and when they have high temporal autocorrelations, you get a cluster, for example, of floods or droughts together, that risk pooling becomes very key because those very correlated experiences in these cores, right, where everyone in my neighborhood is getting hit by this rainfall again and again and again, it means that we'll have to reach out far away to long distance connections to manage that. And so that's something we're testing with data. And further, we can even just look at the distribution of things like frequency or intensity of rainfall across a place like Burkina Faso and think about how this affects things like remittances, like the movement of money and resources across different households that can often span distance. Finally, we can get data on which adaptations reduce risk and at what scale. And for that, we need the right tool. And this is where I'm going to pitch you actually on an app that I'm developing with individuals at my university, Washington State University, and a nonprofit called Urbanova. So we need a solution that takes communities and grassroots solutions seriously and supports them, right, as they're coming up with new solutions and ideas. We need a tool that collects data pertinent to research across time and at scale, so we can understand how adaptation emerges, where it works, where it doesn't. And we also can help funders identify how to best support grassroots adaptation. In the interest of time, I'll only focus on the first two before I close our talk today. So this app is called Climb2 or Climate Together. You can find more about it at climb2.org. I'll show you that link there at the end. But what Climb2 does, first of all, let's focus on this first bit. It supports grassroots climate change adaptation. So the way it does that is on the platform, we actually have 3 different sections focused on learning, discussing, and engaging. So on the Learn tab, this is where folks can actually go to find trusted information from experts. So we only put information on this tab that is coming from individuals at universities or individuals who are working for climate-focused organizations, so that individuals know they can come to the app to find a trusted source of information. Now that information can then actually spur innovation. And this will be interesting, just so everyone thinks through this with me, in terms of trying to localize where adaptation is coming from and how innovations are happening, because of course we're introducing new ones even here in that ecosystem. So it's something to think about. Individuals can share from the Learn tab to the Discuss tab, which is here in the middle. They can talk about different things that they're encountering and then share solutions with one another, which researchers can then track, actually using back-end data, how ideas are moving from person to person in these forums. And then finally, individuals can engage. So they can then go to the Engage tab to take action. The app doesn't create that information. We just pull it from other places that exist, but also to do things like engage in surveys. So researchers can put surveys on that tab and ask individuals, for example, to respond to things about climate change adaptation or similar. We offer users one-stop shopping in terms of climate-related content. So we include forecasts of what's coming. This is something we heard from user groups as individuals really wanted to kind of know what the future was going to be like. They wanted to know how the past was. So we actually show historical data for the individual's area here on the app, and also the interface nice and clean. We want people to be able to come back and enjoy using the app. And for researchers, I mentioned that you can use back-end data, but eventually what we'd like to see happen here, in case this is relevant to you, is we actually want to have a scientific board where you can apply to actually put a survey out through the app. And then if you do put a survey out through the app, you're able to then use the data and then actually put data back into the app in the sense that you share your findings with individuals and they can see it there. So it closes that whole circle. Additionally, privacy is going to be a big issue for us. So actually having an opt-in system where users really know what they're agreeing to before they share their data. And of course, we can also support funders. As I mentioned, I just want to go through this very quickly. For example, funders can incentivize communities to create new innovations by creating competitions on app with rewards for what individuals are doing. So where are we now with Climb2? We are working on prototype testing at the moment. So we're actually now going and taking our prototype to users and looking at how they're actually interacting with it. We're pursuing funding. We have a grant under review, hope to have another one under review soon. And of course, we're engaging in outreach, which is why I'm talking to you, just so you know that this exists. So bringing together everything from today, variability, right? Humans are masters of variability, and we vary because of our responses to that variability. So as everyone knows here, right, again, y'all have worked on this quite a bit, but parochial altruism may be a human universal and that it's universally possible, but levels vary quite a bit across individual, across context, across populations as well. And this is certainly is a function of a few different things in this system, including context and individual differences. But researcher expectations and decisions can also affect how we characterize human sociality. So things that can be really key are things like careful site selection. If we are looking for sites where there's conflict, we will find them. Methodological design, right? And additionally, the interpretation of data. And then turning to climate change adaptation, studying variation in climate change adaptation has a lot of different implications. First of all, structures and networks that are impacted by long-distance relationships then affect how information moves across them, including innovation like candidate adaptations to climate change. Examining the relationship between features of climate variability and grassroots adaptations will really help us understand which adaptations work well under what conditions, so we can help support communities as they are trying to respond. And we need tools to understand how grassroots adaptation emerges and at scale, so we can understand, I said the same thing twice there, so we can support it more quickly and support communities as they respond. Climb2 may be such a tool. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the Mosetenes Interculturales and Chamanes for their time and collaboration, and many people in Bolivia and beyond. And in case you wanted to take a look at any of those papers, here are all the links to the 3 preprints I mentioned and to the Climb2 website. Thank you.